All right, friends, we have enough to start. I'm announcing we have enough to start. So if a few more straggle in, that'll be just fine. But thanks for being here. Always welcome. Come right in. So I'd like to take credit for genius, but I really can't. It was a pure accident that the woman of God that shaped history happens to be Sarah Edwards, who, by the way, of all the women we're going to deal, is most conspicuously famous for being a mother. And I thought, I only thought of it this week. I thought that worked out nicely, because this is really, in many ways, her principal claim to fame, and I hope to prove that to you before we're done. I'm getting a wee bit, not too bad, a little bit of a late start, so I've been whining to my beautiful wife, Candy, all week long that my preparation for this presentation has been more frustrating than any of these, because every day I've had to chop out so much material. My original lecture was about 3 hours long, and I thought that probably is going to stretch it a little. Down to 2 hours, when I have to get it down to about 40 minutes, you know. And the stuff I'm skipping over, it just grieves me. So I want you to know that. If I seem like I'm moving with a little bit of deliberate haste, there's part of the reason. However, if what we say this morning inspires you and makes you want to know a little more about this amazing and remarkable woman, the wife of Jonathan Edwards, Sarah Edwards, there's a wonderful book entitled Marriage to a Difficult Man. And it is worth it. It is a wonderful book, easy to read, very engaging, and it will convince you that she was quite the remarkable woman. And so I'm relying on her input quite a bit for this. Of course, Jonathan Edwards' life is itself well known, and we've lectured on that on other occasions, so some of that will kind of filter into our conversation as well. But anyway, just if you're interested in exploring her life in a little bit more detail than we can cover, then hopefully you'll be able to get that. It's written by a woman named Elizabeth Dobbs, D-O-B-B-S, Elizabeth Dobbs, and it's really very good. So my theme verse for Sarah Edwards is probably not a surprise. It's taken from Proverbs 31, which is a celebration, really, of the woman of the home. And in part, the writer there says, her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. Her children rise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. And that is certainly true. Jonathan Edwards certainly sat with the elders of the land. That's true, and that's an understatement, really. And really, in many ways, Sarah Edwards was probably 80% of the home. And so the wonderful impact that she had on her children and grandchildren, we have to credit her with a great deal of that influence. Certainly Jonathan was there, but he was a famous guy. And the demands on him were astronomical, especially through the Great Awakening. And so we have to credit him for doing what God called him to do, and at the same time, Sarah for keeping the home fires burning, as it were. So anyway, with that brief introduction, let's have a word of prayer. Our Father, we are deeply grateful for the wonderful individuals that you have singled out through history to teach us lessons that can be of use to us. We pray that you would be present this morning with us. We pray that our hearts would be open to hear your word, your truth, through the lens of this remarkable woman, Sarah Edwards. And for that, we give you thanks in advance, asking this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me give you this little other word. It is not. Thank you. See, this is why I married this woman, because she thinks of things. So just a minute here. You know, I live in constant neurotic fear that technology is going to break down. Never happens, does it? But so I have my backup recording just in case. So there we are. Missed the first couple of minutes, but that'll be fine. Anyway, what was I about to say? I forgot. I'm going to press on. It'll come to me in a minute. Oh, I remember what it was. I've disciplined myself to be done, totally done by 12:15. You know, I don't want to hold you all day. So that is my target. I have more material than I can cover in the time I've got to work with. So at some point, when the clock is telling me your time is running out, I'm going to swiftly jump, I'll let you know what happened, to the end of this lecture, because you have to have the end of it to get the point. And so just be aware, there may be a little bit of a quick kind of truncation of the end of this lecture if we have to do it. So anyway, I'm going to, with that little caveat, move along here at as reasonable a pace as we can. Anyway, she was born Sarah Pierrepont, 1709 in New Haven. This is the first of our colonial or American women of God who shaped history, and she certainly qualifies for that description. Really happy childhood as far as we can tell. No bumps or bruises. Her father was a very well-established pastor and scholar. His name was James Pierrepont. He saw to the education of his daughter when many didn't. At that time, of course, it was pretty patriarchal in colonial America, but some enlightened spirits said, nope, the girls need as good an education as the guys, and he was one who really focused on that, and we're glad he did, because she was able to carry that education forward into her own family. So she was homeschooled in all of the important things that we would expect from any good education from a man who himself was very well educated. Edwards, Jonathan Edwards, came to the University of Yale, which had been founded in part by James Pierrepont. He was one of the founders, and so he shows up here. Harvard had already been there for a while. It was the first of these. This is kind of the second of those Ivy League schools, as we call them. He enrolled at Yale when he was 13 years old, which is a little earlier than you might expect, but of course he was a child prodigy, and everybody knew that. He was a flaming genius, and that was conspicuous about Jonathan Edwards even from his earliest years. He met Sarah, the daughter of James, when he was 22 years old, and she was just in her early to mid teenage years. He wrote a little essay. It's sometimes called Edwards' apostrophe. I don't know why it's called an apostrophe, but that's the word they used. But anyway, it's a wonderful little essay he wrote at 22 years old about Sarah Pierrepont when she was probably 14 or 15 years old. All right? I'm not going to give you much of it, but it'll give you a flavor. So this is Jonathan Edwards at 22 describing her, and he says, quote, "They say there is a young lady in New Haven who is beloved of that great being who made and rules the world, and that there are certain seasons in which this great being in some way or another invisible comes to her and fills her mind with exceeding sweet delight, and that she hardly cares for anything except to meditate on him. Therefore, if you present all the world before her with the riches of its treasures, she disregards it and cares not for it, and is unmindful of any pain or affliction." And he just goes on in that kind of style. There's a technical word to describe Edwards' view of Sarah. It's a technical word, you may have heard it, twitterpated. He just seems to have been pretty much swept away by her loveliness even when she was a young teenage girl. He, on the other hand, Edwards was tall. He was over 6 feet tall. He was at 22 years old a little awkward. You know, he was one of these guys who's a genius in his brain, but social grace was kind of lost on him. Can be sometimes true. It's true of geniuses. They can be a little eccentric. And Edwards certainly, he grew out of it eventually, but at this point he was kind of an awkward guy. He tried to, after he would go to the James Pierrepont Church in New Haven, and he always wanted to talk with Sarah after, and she kind of it's like, I don't know about this guy. And so she kept her distance, which only served to frustrate him a little bit more. But eventually, James, the dad, and Sarah herself figured out that there's more under the hood to this guy than meets the eye at first appearance, you know. And so she began to take more of an interest. And indeed, they developed a courtship over time and became engaged in the year 1725. She was 17 years old. And in those days, that was pretty typical. They were married on July 28, 1727. And so at that point, their married life gets started. Edwards at that point had already been a pastor for a couple of years. He graduated from Yale, and the first church he pastored was a Presbyterian church, I'm happy to tell you. And actually, Jonathan Edwards, all his life, was partial to the Presbyterians. But he lived in the kind of New England region generally, where the congregational influence had really taken root much more. The Presbyterians were down in Philadelphia. The Congregationalists, who had their roots in England, the Puritans, more in New England, Massachusetts Bay, and so on. And so he was there. And so for most of his career, he was the pastor of a congregational church. But he admits he liked the Presbyterians. He thought their approach to church government was a little better. Second year, 1726, he goes to Northampton. And that's where he pastored for the next 25 years or so. His grandfather was the pastor of the Northampton Congregational Church, a man named Solomon Stoddard. I got an email from a guy sometime back whose last name was Stoddard. And he said he could trace his ancestry directly to Solomon Stoddard. It's like the great-great-great-great-grandson, you know. And he was pretty proud of that name, and rightly so. It's a wonderful name. And actually, Solomon Stoddard was the grandfather of Jonathan Edwards. He was 85 years old when Edwards showed up. And so they began to switch off. Stoddard was getting up there. And this gave him a little bit of relief from the preaching duties. It was in the 1727, you know, that they got married. So he'd already been pastoring for a couple of years. Odd custom was that the first time a wife of a pastor came to church, she'd wear her wedding dress, which might seem like a strange thing to do. It wasn't our type wedding dresses, very, you know, white and flourish, that kind of thing. But it was a nice dress. Anyway, she wore it that first week, and all the eyes were on her. This was the new bride of Jonathan Edwards. The Edwards home, Sarah was a homemaker. Income was modest, but she did what she could with a certain degree of flair. But part of the responsibility of a wife of a pastor, even an associate pastor, was really to have kind of an open welcome mat to your home. And so it was expected that people would drop by, sometimes overnight guests and so on. Your home was a bit of a, you know, there's a traffic pattern through there. And so she was sort of immediately thrust into that role of being a hostess. And she does seem to be a little bit of a perfectionist, which plays a role in the story, so hang on to that. But she wanted to do everything just about perfectly, you know, and she really seemed to be pretty capable of that. She was quite competent. And so anyway, that was the beginning of this life together. They had their first child in 1728, a baby girl named Sarah. This happened to be the first of 11 children born to Jonathan and Sarah Edwards. 11 children, one of them was a boy. So Jonathan grew up surrounded by females. You know, this was kind of the order of the day. He became the senior pastor. Solomon Stoddard died about 3 years later, and so he became the pastor of that church. Their second child was born in 1730. Elizabeth Dobbs, who I mentioned from her biography, made an interesting comment concerning this second birth. Some ministers in those days refused to baptize children born on Sunday because it was believed that children arrived on the same day of the week that they had been conceived. If you get my drift, you know. Now, we don't think that's actually true. in terms of medical technology. But it was a belief at the time, and it was also a belief that there's certain things you shouldn't do on Sunday. And so that's where that came from. Well, interestingly enough, they had 6 more daughters, all conspicuously born on Sunday, which really did raise some eyebrows in that church. I'm just going to leave that to your own creative imagination to wonder what the church made of that. But anyway, you know, that was just a fact of their married life. Edwards had started to make a name for himself fairly early. He's a young man, but he's certainly recognized as a brilliant theological mind. This is before he's really become famous, but even here he's beginning to be recognized. And he was asked to come and speak at Harvard. Harvard was there first, then Yale. Yale was kind of the new kid on the block. And so the whole idea was, you know, is this education that people are getting from Yale up to snuff? Perry Miller is a name you may know. He was the premier professor of English literature at Harvard in the mid-20th century. He's really credited with rediscovering the Puritans. The Puritans had labored under a really awful caricature of these very sour, dour people that never smiled and were fearful that somebody somewhere was having a good time. You know, this kind of really perverse misrepresentation of them. Perry Miller thought, you know, let's go take a second look. He was not a Christian, to my knowledge. He never gave any evidence of that, but he just was interested in this movement. He became fascinated, and he's really credited with the guy that sort of reversed, among academics, the view of the Puritans. He especially became fascinated with Jonathan Edwards and maintained to the day of his death that the most brilliant philosopher ever produced in America was Jonathan Edwards. He wrote so deeply, so profoundly, and was so aware of all that was going on in the world and penetrating analysis of it that I think he'd agree with what he just, you know, even to this day, I think he would say that. Anyway, I say all of that to give this quote from Perry Miller. We may indeed be certain that all ministers not bedridden or in the dotage, together with the president, professor, and tutors of Harvard College, as well as many substantial citizens, were on hand. This is when Edwards spoke at Harvard. This is not routine performance. It was the first time so large a collection of Harvard men had an opportunity to take the measure of a Yale education. So Edwards is their first exposure to what people are learning at Yale. Afterward, Miller says, the Boston ministers congratulated the happy church at Northampton on whom Providence had bestowed such a gift. He made quite an impression. The difficulty is kind of the inside story is even though Edwards was beginning to move into much more prominent fame, I would say, within the culture of the day, Sarah was having to deal with the other side of the story, the inside story, because he was a difficult guy. You know, hence the name of the book, Marriage to a Difficult Man. He was sometimes late for dinner. He was one of these geniuses that would get so involved in what he was working on, he'd forget to eat, he'd forget to show up, he'd forget to do kind of the things you expect a husband to do around the house. He had unpredictable moods. He was a difficult guy. And Sarah was put to the task of kind of managing not only the home side of Jonathan, but also the visible expression of who he was. And so there was a little bit of that sort of friendly tension that was going on in the family. And Edwards was aware of it. He was, among other things, a very humble man. He was very aware of the kind of deficiencies that were conspicuous in his life. He wrote this in his journal. I have had a very affecting view of my own sinfulness and vileness, very frequently, to such a degree as to hold me in a kind of loud weeping, so that I've often been forced to shut myself up. He beat himself up for it, but in some ways this was kind of an inescapable piece of his personality. So the town tended to see composed dignity in Edwards. Sarah saw more of the stormy side of it, and that put some pressure on her. So she's a little bit of a perfectionist, and she's also got some management challenges here in terms of the home front and being the wife of the pastor. Just keep all of that percolating as we go along. So it's a little bit of a complicated relationship. Edwards always adored her. That was never lost. He loved spending time with her, but the demands on his time were increasingly eroding the opportunity to do that. But he tried as much as possible, at least in the afternoons, to go on a little horseback ride with her. And in some ways, that was the opportunity to reconnect. They would just go out, the two of them, and he would sometimes test his thoughts for the upcoming sermon against her practical mind. You know, I loved reading that because it reminded me of my own beautiful wife. She knows that I tend to get lost in technicalia. I just love it. The more obscure, the better. That is just, you know, and I have a tendency to bring that to class, and people go, "So what?" And she always reminds me, people want practicalia, not technicalia. And I think that was what Sarah gave to Jonathan Edwards. He would take the deep dive into stuff, and she'd say, "Well, yeah, but you know, what about the price of beans here? You know, let's kind of keep it at a level that is actually of some use for people." Okay, the story gets more complicated. Mid-1730s, probably 1735, 1736, the first hint of what's called the Great Awakening. This is not the Great Awakening proper, but it's kind of the first little hint in that direction. Takes place with the preaching of Edwards. In other words, there's some sermons he preaches that have an unexpected impact, more than you would have expected, as if to say something else is going on here than just a good sermon, something else that really appeared to be the work of God's Spirit. The problem was that while this early hint of the Great Awakening brought in a lot of unlikely converts, it raised a certain amount of tension in the church, which wasn't so sure they wanted all these converts. You know that phenomenon? We have a happy little family here, and what about these people that are coming in that just don't look quite like they're cut out of the same mold? And the people in the church who've been there for years begin to be a little bit, you know, uneasy. Somebody's sitting in my pew. I mean, what are you going to do with this? And so you've got this kind of tension arising along the way. Edwards himself was aware of this. Religion was the one topic of conversation. Scarcely a single person in the whole town was left unconcerned about the great things of the eternal world. What happened was about 500 new people joined the church. That's a lot of people for, you know, this modest-sized town. Half of them were men. It just spread through the whole community. And others were coming just to see the spectacle because something was happening that was so unexpected. And you can't say it was, you know, Jonathan didn't improve his sermon, something like that. It was something else. Well, that put more pressure on Sarah because now you've got a conflicted church, really, a conflicted church over a great outpouring of God's Spirit, you know, that kind of thing. Jonathan is becoming a little bit more controversial because of this, and she, of course, still is trying to do some very beautiful damage control to keep sure, you know, make sure that everything is going as it should. This was only the beginning of his fame. In 1737, Jonathan wrote a book entitled A Faithful Narrative of Surprising Conversions, in which he was describing some of these unexpected displays of unlikely conversions that had just happened the last couple of years. It was published in London, was immediately a bestseller in England. It was distributed the next year in the colonies, and it really put Jonathan Edwards on the map more than he had been before. Now this is a major bestseller, you might say, in the Christian world. John Wesley, who of course was responsible for a huge movement in England, wrote of that book, "Surely this is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." John Wesley giving his stamp of approval on this. And so it really did change kind of the flavor of Edwards and his career at that point. Then you have a whole bunch of turmoil. It's like the Great Awakening happens, and then a great reversal. An epidemic swept through New Haven and other regions. About 91 people in the town died. 81 of them were children. The Edwards home was exempted. Some people thought it was because Sarah was so meticulous about hygiene and that sort of thing. That may be the case. The next year there was an invasion of crows. I'm not making this up. You know, it's like, I think that's where Alfred Hitchcock got the idea. All of these crows just come in, they're everywhere, you know, and it was like a plague. There were 2 suicides in the town, all of these things militating to create really a turmoil in the town that was odd because it came immediately after this sort of a hint of a great awakening. You can kind of sense what was going on. Edwards wrote in his journal, in the latter part of May, it began to be very sensible that the Spirit of God was gradually withdrawing from us. And after this time, Satan seemed to be more let loose and raged in a dreadful manner. So you can tell it was just kind of... And then there was a bitterly cold winter, just to make matters worse. And of course, in that day, they didn't have central furnaces. It was, you know, everything you knew just to stay warm in their homes. Jonathan was aware that Sarah was feeling the stress. She kept a very good front out there, but internally she was beginning to feel the wear and tear of all of these various kind of stresses and strains. He wrote once again, she had been subject to unsteadiness and many ups and downs, often subject to melancholy. She emerged from that, but kind of shaky. It seemed like it was kind of getting to her. That was the idea. She had especially a fair amount of anxiety over the enemies that it seemed that Jonathan Edwards was developing. Of course, we're not living at that time. We may not know this, but he was a very controversial character. People tended to love him or hate him. The people who didn't like him were very suspicious of the emotionalism that they associated with what was called the Great Awakening. The people that loved him, of course, believed he was a great agent of God's work among them, you know, and so it was that kind of thing. And she was out there kind of feeling that stress. That was really putting pressure on her. Edwards at one point in one sermon addressed himself to the congregation saying, "The contentions which have been among you since I first became your pastor have been one of the greatest burdens I've labored under. Not only the contentions that you've had with me, but those you have had with one another about your land and other concerns." He's kind of complaining to them about the fact that they become so divisive along the way. Then the Great Awakening. See, there was the first hint a few years earlier. Now George Whitfield shows up. George Whitfield, you may know, was English. He came here. He was an Anglican priest, ordained. He came in 1738. Was in Savannah, Georgia, recognized a desperate need for an orphanage, especially among the black slave population there. He went back to England, raised a bunch of money, came back, established an orphanage called Bethesda. The institution's still there. It's not an orphanage anymore, but the original institution is there. He started it, and then he began to preach. And once again, it was just a little over the top. He was a wonderful orator, much better than Jonathan Edwards. He was dramatic, but nevertheless, you'd have to say something more than pure oratory was producing the effects. When people would hear a sermon and stay later for hours weeping and lamenting, confessing their sins, just this kind of amazing display of something that you'd call a kind of supernatural expression of God's presence among them. Well, George Whitfield arrived in New Haven, moved in for a few days with the Edwards because they opened their home to him and, of course, anyone coming along. He was just amazed at the family life. He loved it. He thought this was next to heaven. He wrote a lot about it, but one little quote from his journal. "A sweeter couple I've not seen. She talked feelingly and solidly of the things of God and seemed to be such a helpmeet for her husband that she caused me to pray to God that he would be pleased to send me a daughter of Abraham to be my wife." You know, he was an unmarried man at this point, and he never really thought about getting married, but he thought, this is kind of nice, look at this, and he was pretty amazed with it. All right, 1741. This is when Edwards preaches his so-called great sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. How many of you had to read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? All right, you have to be old. It used to be required reading you know, in public high school. I remember having to read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God in English class in high school. It's somehow faded from view. It is a masterpiece. And he preached it in his own church in June 1741 to a lackluster response. Everybody goes, "Oh, another good sermon, what are you doing for dinner?" You know, kind of thing. It was just, this was the church. Then, the next month, he got a kind of a quick call from Enfield, which was about, you know, some miles away, small town, and asking if he could do a pulpit fill there. He didn't have time to prepare a new sermon, so he just grabbed the manuscript from Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and he went and preached. And the effect in that church was just, he was as surprised as anybody. He was astonished. As people, one description, yelled, shrieked, rolled in the aisles, crowded up to the pulpit, begged him to stop preaching because they were feeling such conviction of the Spirit of God on their hearts. And he kept telling them, "Would you please quiet down so I can finish my sermon?" Edwards preached, you know, he wasn't a bombastic preacher. He was nearsighted. He preached always from a manuscript, unlike George Whitfield, which preached extemporaneously. He just, you know, it was wide open. But he always preached from a closely, tightly written manuscript held up to his face. He had kind of a high-pitched voice, the last thing in the world you would associate with a great evangelist, and yet people were just melting down in the pews. And that continued. This whole Great Awakening phenomenon was really quite an astonishing thing. So this is really the true Great Awakening. It's 1740, 1741, 1742. This launched Edwards into an 8-month absence from home, as the demands on him were, and of George Whitfield, both of them, you see, not traveling together, but both of them being called to various preaching venues, and the Great Awakening was a phenomenon. Some have said it was the central thing that united the colonies. They weren't 13 colonies anymore. They became one kind of, united place, at least psychologically, because of this. He was asked to come and speak at Yale. This was in September 1741. And he was asked to speak giving an assessment of what people were now beginning to call the Great Awakening. And he spoke favorably of it. And that got him into a lot of trouble at Yale, because there were many there, kind of the old school folks, who thought this is just pure emotionalism. This is some kind of emotional disease. We need to get over it. This is not good. And they have and now they begin to have a more negative view, of course, even more than they had, about Edwards. And so this is what's going on. Sarah's at home, managing a complicated situation. Her husband is out in great demand. He's become now pretty much famous across all the colonies, and even in England, he's very well known by this time. A young man enters the home at this point named Samuel Hopkins. He's a fresh graduate from Yale, a young man, probably about 20 years old, kind of a gloomy, depressed guy. He comes to New Haven because he wants to meet Jonathan Edwards and somehow have some help with what is evidently kind of a dark view of life. You know, that's really it. So he comes. Edwards is out of town. Sarah says, "Hey, we have this room. You can stay here. It's just fine." She was very welcoming in that regard. And so he shows up. He wrote in his own journal this. He said, "When I arrived there, Mr. Edwards was not at home, but I was received with great kindness by Mrs. Edwards and the family." There were several daughters, of course, by then, "and had encouragement that I might live there during the winter. Mr. Edwards was absent on a preaching tour. I was very gloomy and most of the time retired in my chamber." He continues, after some days, Mrs. Edwards came in and said I was now become a member of the family for a season, and she felt interested in my welfare. And as she observed that I appeared gloomy and dejected, she hoped I would not think she intruded for desiring to know and asking me what was the occasion of it. I told her, I was in a Christless, graceless state. Upon which we entered into a free conversation. And she told me that she had prayed respecting me since I'd been in the family, that she trusted that I should receive light and comfort and doubted not that God intended yet to do great things for me. This really speaks well, of course, of Sarah. While she's feeling all the stress, she still reaches out to this young man. I just want you to make a mental note of the name Samuel Hopkins, because we're going to mention him again 2 weeks from now. We don't meet next week, Diamond, whatever. I'm in that club, by the way, you're wondering. 2 weeks, we're going to come back and look at Sarah Osborne and Samuel Hopkins. This is some years later. Those two were the two most militant voices in the colonial period against slavery. They were both well known in a time where that was a complicated issue. The South, of course, had widespread practice of slavery. The North had some questions about it, and these two were just both solidly speaking publicly against the institution. They were the early abolitionists, you might say. But at this point, Hopkins isn't there, but this is really kind of the career that he would have. Anyway, Hopkins gives us this wonderful glimpse into Sarah Edwards, and I have to give you this quote because it says so much about her. This is Samuel Hopkins, this is his observation after several months living in the Edwards home. She had an excellent way of governing her children. She knew how to make them regard and obey her cheerfully without loud, angry words, much less heavy blows. She seldom punished them, and in speaking to them used gentle and pleasant words. If any correction was necessary, she did not administer it in a passion. But when she had occasion to reprove or rebuke, she would do it in a few words without warmth, as in anger or noise. In her directions and manners of importance, she would address herself to the reason of her children, that they might not only know her will, but at the same time be convinced of the reasonableness of it. Really quite a remarkable description from a young man just observing her way in the family, and so we get some of that. All right, the 1740s. Sarah has what most people call a nervous breakdown. I'm not sure that's a right diagnosis, but at this distance, that's what people have said. At any rate, Edwards came back, 8 months gone now. Comes back home, this is 1742, he finds his beautiful wife in an emotional crisis. I think probably we'd say she just collapses under the withering criticisms, not only directed at Jonathan, coming from the church, even at her. This was just becoming kind of a stormy time, and she was a person who just could hardly bear it, She herself wrote, reflecting on this a little later, "This I much disliked in myself. The peace and calm of my mind seemed sensibly above the reach of disturbance from anything but these two. First, my own good name and fair reputation among men, and especially the esteem and just treatment of the people of the town." She was worried about what people thought of her. Can you imagine it? Anybody worried about what the people think about them? Secondly, and more especially, the esteem and love and kind treatment of my husband. She had worked so hard, and I think the criticisms that were just bandering around the town were finally just enough to kind of cause her to reach her limit. It lasted about a month. Edwards himself, of course, having come back, regretted, I suppose, being gone so long. He tried to do everything he could, and she gradually recovered from it. But I think Edwards' reflection on this in his own journals and so on suggests he thinks that was kind of the great corrective, that she was working too hard, too worried, going out of her way to try to maintain a sort of perfect image, Now, she was a wonderful person. I don't want to overstate this, but I think at this point it was kind of like something good happened. It was painful, but good. She was a little bit of a different person, a little more relaxed, because the storms got even worse, but she seemed to take it even better. So I think this was kind of an important moment that was a bit of a corrective for her. At least that's the way some have seen it. I think there's something to it. Certainly as a mother, she was wonderful. She taught them all the skills and so on. Hopkins says, a kind and gentle treatment they received from their mother, while she strictly and punctiliously maintained her parental authority, seemed naturally to promote a filial respect and affection, and to lead them to a milder, tender treatment of each other. Quarreling and contention, which too frequently take place among children, were in her family unknown. Hopkins says of the relationship to Jonathan as a wife, it was a happy circumstance that he could trust everything to the care of Mrs. Edwards with entire safety and undoubting confidence. She was the most judicious, faithful mistress of the family, habitually industrious, a sound economist, managing her household affairs with diligence and discretion. While Jonathan was there, and by this time the Great Awakening is winding down a little bit, he's at home more, he spent time with his kids, with his family. He educated the daughters as James Pierrepont had educated Sarah. He wanted them to receive the same kind of education, same education that any boys would get anywhere else. You know, that was still kind of a divided culture then. So they learned Greek, they learned Latin, they learned rhetoric, they learned penmanship. Jonathan taught them church history, chronology of events. He would routinely at evening dinner pop on them a quiz of some trivia from the Old Testament. He loved to do this. And the one that was mentioned by Elizabeth Dobbs was this question. How many of you could answer this off the top of your head? How many years after the fall of Jerusalem did Cyrus free the Jewish people to return to their land? That's right. That's pretty close. That's good. So, no, not bad. So anyway, conflicts continued to arise. Conflicts, now this is where I've had to chop out so much, so I'm just mentioning them to you. There was conflicts with the Boston clergy who were positively hostile to the Great Awakening. Charles Chauncey, you may know that name. He was the most prominent pastor in Boston. He thought the Great Awakening was the work of the devil. He was just vigorously resentful of this emotionalism, as he called it. There were conflicts over what was called the halfway covenant. I'd love to explain that to you. It was a practice, a policy that had come from Solomon Stoddard and even earlier. And Jonathan began to have doubts about it conscientiously, and I'll just say that. There were conflicts over George Whitfield, who had become quite a controversial character. He came back to New Haven. Some churches refused to let him preach in their churches. They just viewed him as such a negative influence. Finally, James Pierrepont, the father of Sarah, arranged for him to preach outdoors. He built the platform, and he was a great supporter. There was grief over a guy named David Brainerd. This is a wonderful story in its own right. He had been a kind of a missionary to the Native Americans. He traveled around. He'd ridden like 3,000 miles on horseback, going from village to village, preaching. But in the process, he was constantly, increasingly suffering from ill health, probably tuberculosis. Wound up in the home of the Edwards. When he was near death, he was only a young man, he was probably around less than 30. He wound up in the Edwards home. A daughter, one of the daughters of the Edwards, was a name, gal, I'm not sure how to say it, I think it's Yerusha, really liked David Brainerd. She really fell in love with him. He was there, he was sick, tuberculosis, bedridden. He'd been kind of working himself to death, and she nursed him really during those years that he was there. He died in their home on Valentine's Day, 1747. Yerusha actually contracted tuberculosis and died a few months later herself. So that's the one loss in the family that was a source of great grief to all of them. Edwards wrote, "I would not conclude my observations without acknowledging with thankfulness the gracious dispensation of providence to me and my family, and so ordering it that he should be brought in, that is, David Brainerd should be brought into my house in his last illness." Okay, 1750s. Edwards gets fired. The Northampton church has had it with him. The stated reason was the halfway covenant, controversy there, but the church had been really divided about him for some time. And so, you know, he's out of a job. It is astonishing. He was by far, transcendently, the most powerful mind in the colonies at that time. I think anybody would have granted that, except his own church. You know, a prophet isn't without honor, the kind of deal. He had many offers come flooding in. A Presbyterian church immediately wanted him to come and be their pastor. The newly chartered College of New Jersey, which eventually became Princeton, said, please come and be a professor here. He was so worn out, and Sarah was so kind of worn out as well, that they were looking for something a little bit less demanding. And actually our friend Samuel Hopkins came across a little Native American village called Stockbridge, about 50 miles from New Haven. These are called Housatonic Indians. They were part of the broader Mohican tribal families. They had some missionary groups had purchased there some land for a mission in this little town. They had a school of 55 children. These are school-age children, like 5 years old to 15. 55 children. A church of 42 people. Jonathan thought, that sounds good. That sounds like what I'd like to do. And so they moved there. He would preach on Sundays through an interpreter to these Native American Indians, and he wrote to his father, still alive at that point, my wife and children are well pleased with our present situation. They like the place much better than they expected. This was just a very small kind of, I don't want to use the term Indian reservation, that term. They didn't have that yet, obviously, but it was just a very small rural and impoverished town. It was not anything to write home about, but he liked it. They liked the place much better than they expected. Here, at present, we live in peace, which has for a long time been an unusual thing for us. The Indians seem much pleased with my family, especially my wife. There's a funny little anecdote I'm going to take the time to mention, because this was when they would go on extended horseback rides at the end of the day. And sometimes Edwards would go out by himself because he was thinking. This is when he wrote some of his most penetrating philosophical work, was in Stockbridge, and so on. He would go out and on these extended horseback rides just by himself, and as thoughts came to him, he would write down little notes. They were so impoverished, he had to write in a minuscule print on tiny scraps of paper, and then he would pin it to himself. And so Sarah said that when he came back from one of those horseback rides, he always looked like he'd just ridden through a snowstorm, because he had all of these little pieces of paper pinned all over his garments, all of these little things. But anyway, it was a place of healing for them. They took daily walks. He wrote some of his most profound work, The Freedom of the Will, many other things that came out of that quiet time in Stockbridge. The French and Indian War, I won't talk about that, but it did kind of represent a disruption. He was offered, on the unexpected death of the president of the College of New Jersey, he was offered the job to be the president. At first, he said he wasn't sure he was up to the job. He didn't feel qualified. He was always underestimated himself. I don't think he really appreciated what a genius he was, but finally he accepted. After lengthy discussions with Sarah, he took the job. About the week before he took the job, he got a smallpox vaccination, which was still being practiced at that time, it still is. But at this point, he contracted smallpox and died. So he was 1 week in office as the president of the College of New Jersey, and he was dead in a week. His closing words, last words, these were recorded. He said, "Give my kindest love to my dear wife. Tell her that the uncommon union which has so long persisted between us has been of such a nature as I trust is spiritual and therefore will continue forever." As it turns out, Sarah died not long afterwards. She moved to Philadelphia. She was welcomed into the church of Gilbert Tennant, who was a name you may know, but he was the pastor of the major Presbyterian church there. They'd been married for 31 years. She died on October 2nd of the same year, 49 years old. She, according to two witnesses who were there during her last few moments, said this: she apprehended her death was near when she expressed her entire resignation to God and her desire that he might be glorified in all things, and that she might be enabled to glorify him to the last, she continued in such a temper, calm and resigned, until she died. All right. My timing has worked out perfectly. Because I want to say this. Neither Jonathan nor Sarah could necessarily have predicted what would become of their children. She's 49, her children are still, I mean, they're reaching adulthood for the most part, of course, but they're young and their careers are not yet known. There was a fellow named Albert Winship in the year 1900, so 126 years ago. He published a book in which he had traced the family tree, not ancestry, but descendants of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards, just to see what these children of theirs had done, you know, in terms of their marriages and their lives. And he compiled the following statistics. This is in 1900, so all of this is reflecting things from the 1800s. There had been 13 college presidents, 65 professors, 100 lawyers, and a dean of an outstanding law school, 30 judges, 66 physicians, and a dean of a medical school, 80 holders of public office, including 3 senators, mayors of 3 large cities, governors of 3 states, a vice president of the United States, a controller of the U.S. Treasury. There were also members of the family that had written a total of 135 books, edited 18 journals and periodicals, and sent 100 missionaries overseas from this one family, you know, and their descendants down through that. He says, many large banks, banking houses, and insurance companies have been directed by them. They have been the owners or superintendents of large coal mines, of large iron plants, and vast oil interests, silver mines. There's scarcely any great American industry that has not had one of this family among its chief promoters. The family has cost the country nothing in pauperism, in crime, in hospital or asylum service. On the contrary, it represents the highest usefulness. Has any other mother contributed more vitally to the leadership of a nation, he asks. So I thought for Mother's Day, that was probably a good reminder, you know, that here's a woman who was certainly a wonderful, understated. You know, we don't have a lot of what she said, but her presence, the instruction she gave to her children, the help that she was to her husband through some very stormy, very complicated years of high controversy and so on, and yet nevertheless the family certainly bears evidence to the not only genius of these two people, but of course God's grace in their lives as well. And I thought, you know, that was a good place to end this as a Sunday school thought. Never underestimate the impact you're having on somebody. You know, never underestimate that. I have the opportunity, really the privilege every week to homeschool 2 of my grandkids. I just teach them Bible, you know, I'm not teaching them all the other stuff. Just we have a little one session, and I love these girls because it's, you know, what an opportunity to sit down with 2 people you love and cherish. And I'd like to believe that, you know, these little conversations we have with some humor and some, you know, joking around, but some substantive biblical truth will reach into their core and shape them and their kids and their grandkids and so on. And we all have that kind of opportunity, don't we? We all have people in our lives that we can have that kind of effect as well. So Sarah's a good reminder of that, and I'm done, and it's exactly 12:15.